Because in the Teutoburg Forest, death was waiting. The year was 9 AD. Rome was unstoppable, or so it believed. Its army stretched from the deserts of Africa to the cold rivers of Germania. 3 legions, led by the proud General Varus, marched deep into the Germanic wilderness. They thought they were bringing civilization, but in truth, they were walking into a grave. For in those woods, a man they trusted, a Roman-trained commander named Arminius, was waiting. To Rome, he was an ally. To his people, he was a savior. And in the rain-soaked forest, trust would turn into betrayal, steel into blood, and the fate of an empire would shatter forever. This is not the story of Netflix's Barbarians. This is the story of the real tribes and the battle that broke Rome. The forest is still. Mist drapes over the trees, like a burial shroud. Somewhere in the distance, a raven calls, its cry carried by the cold wind. Beneath the canopy, shadows shift, men moving, armed with spears and shields, their faces painted not for glory, but to mask fear. They are not the polished warriors you've seen on screen. They are lean, scarred, their hands hardened from hunger and toil. History, like the mist, hides its truth. Netflix's Barbarians gave us a tale of heroes and villains, of noble speeches and decisive battles. But the real Germanic world was not a legend, it was survival. These tribes lived in a land that seemed to conspire against them. Winters dragged endlessly, freezing rivers and fields. Wolves prowled starving villages. Food was scarce, and the weak were left behind. For every child who survived the cold, another perished, nameless, unmarked in the soil. Inside the smoky huts of villages, life was fragile. Women bent beneath the weight of firewood. Children carried water, and men argued bitterly over cattle or stolen land. These were not united people. They were Cherusci, Chatti, Swabi, Marcomanni, scattered names, bound not by one nation but by endless rivalries and fragile truces. Barbarians chose them as a brotherhood against Rome. In truth, they fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. And yet, across the Rhine, loomed Rome, to modern eyes an empire, to the tribes a god of iron and stone. Soldiers drilled in perfect lines, their armor gleaming, their discipline unbreakable. Roads carved through wilderness, fortresses rose from earth like mountains. To fight Rome was not simply rebellion. It was defiance against the very shape of order itself. Among the tribes stood one man who embodied that contradiction, Arminius. The show paints him as a reluctant hero, pulled between 2 worlds. The truth is sharper. He was a hostage given to Rome, trained in their ways, steeped in their language, raised in their camps. He wore their armor, drank at their feasts, spoke their tongue. He was not merely familiar with Rome, he was Rome. And when he returned to his people, he was no longer fully one of them. Imagine him, standing at the edge of a river, armor removed, staring at his reflection. On one side of the water, his Roman past, order, discipline, power. On the other side, the forest of his ancestors, wild, untamed, unyielding. He whispers into the dark, "Am I Roman, or am I nothing?" The answer would come in blood, but uniting the tribes was never destiny. It was desperation. Every oath Arminius demanded was brittle, every promise fragile. Some chiefs longed for Roman trade, others envied Arminius's influence. Distrust festered in every firelit council. What Netflix condenses into loyalty was, in truth, a web of suspicion. Arminius was not leading a nation. He was gambling with chaos. And yet, he had one ally, silent but eternal, the forest. To the Romans, it was terrain. To Arminius, it was a weapon. He knew its paths, its storms, its secrets. The trees could funnel armies. The mud could swallow wagons. The rain could turn iron into rust. One night, he walked alone through the woods, placing his hand against the bark of an ancient oak. He whispered as though the forest itself might answer. Above him, a crow cawed, and the sound carried like an omen. The stage was set. Soon, Rome would march into the heart of Germania, trusting its legions, blind to the storm gathering in the trees. But the story you think you know, the clean battle lines, the heroic speeches, the triumphant music, that is only a shadow. The truth lies deeper, where men became wolves, and wolves tore apart an empire. The mist thickens. The drums of Rome echo faintly in the distance. The forest waits. The year was 9 AD. 3 Roman legions, led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, marched eastward, deeper into Germania than any commander before him dared. To Varus, this was not conquest, but administration. His task was simple: to govern, to collect taxes, to extend Roman law into the wilderness. He trusted his officers, trusted his maps, and most of all, trusted Arminius, the Roman-trained Germanic cavalry officer who had sworn loyalty to him. But trust can be the deadliest weapon. Arminius rode alongside the Romans, his posture perfect, his armor gleaming in the pale light. The legionnaires saw him as one of their own, a barbarian polished by Roman discipline. But in his silence, he was calculating. Every bend in the road, every patch of marsh, every narrowing trail through the Teutoburg Forest, he marked them not as obstacles, but as traps. The Germanic chiefs had gathered in secret. Men who had once feuded bitterly now sat across the same fires. Some distrusted Arminius. Others saw only the chance to strike the beast that had demanded their children as hostages, their land as tribute, their gods as lesser than Jupiter. Yet as Arminius spoke, his voice cutting through the smoke, they listened. He did not promise glory. He promised survival. Meanwhile, the Romans moved in columns that stretched for miles, their baggage wagons creaking under rain-soaked supplies. The forest swallowed sound. Armor clinked, but the usual thunder of Roman marching boots seemed muffled, uneasy. Soldiers muttered about the sky. Dark, low clouds heavy with storms. They were not on the open fields of Gaul or the paved roads of Italy. They were in a labyrinth of trees, and the forest did not belong to them. On the 3rd day, the rain began. It was relentless, turning the soil into muck, dragging wagons into pits. The shields grew heavier, the bows weaker, the tempers shorter. Varus, blind to the tension, pressed on. To him, Germania was already conquered. It was only a matter of teaching the barbarians the ways of Rome. But the forest whispered otherwise. Somewhere ahead, the Germans prepared. Spears were sharpened. Shields painted with crude symbols of wolves, ravens, and thunder. Warriors stripped themselves of armor to move swiftly through the woods. Mothers and wives waited in silence, their eyes on the mist. And Arminius? He vanished. Under the pretext of rallying allies, he slipped away from the Roman column. Varus, so assured of his loyalty, allowed it. It was the gravest mistake of his life. By nightfall, the trap was sealed. Hidden beneath the trees, thousands of Germanic warriors waited, their breath steaming in the cold. They could hear the Romans struggling in the mud, cursing the storm, their lines stretched and broken. The forest was ready. The moment would come not with a trumpet, but with the sudden cry of a horn, a sound not Roman, but wild, ancient and unyielding. The forest would close, and Rome would bleed. The rain fell harder, drumming on leather, iron, and mud. Roman soldiers hunched beneath the weight of their sodden cloaks, their shields heavy, their tempers frayed. The long column stretched into the mist like a snake with a broken spine. Discipline, Rome's greatest weapon, began to crack under the strain of exhaustion. Men muttered in Latin about the endless forest, the sucking mire, the unseen enemy. Then it came. A horn, not Roman, a raw, jagged cry that split the forest like thunder. Before Varus could order the lines to tighten, the trees themselves seemed to erupt. From the dripping pines, from the tangled undergrowth, from the very earth, warriors burst forth. Their screams were not the ordered chants of legions, but wild howls, animalistic and relentless. Spears rained down, whistling through the downpour. Arrows hissed. Shields splintered. A Roman centurion toppled, his red crest torn away by a jagged axe. The legions tried to form up, but the forest was too tight, the mud too deep. The testudo, the impenetrable Roman shield wall, was impossible here. The wagons stuck fast, horses panicked, men slipped into ditches filled with rain. Rome's greatest weapon, discipline, turned to chaos in the forest's grip. And from the shadows, Arminius appeared. no longer the polished officer of Rome, but a wolf among his kin. His voice carried over the storm, urging the Germans on, every strike of his blade a betrayal to the empire that had raised him. To his warriors, he was no longer a man torn between two worlds. He was their vengeance made flesh. The Romans fought bravely, desperately. Legionnaires hacked through the undergrowth, their short swords red with blood. They killed, they resisted, but every step forward sank them deeper into the swamp of ambush. For each German who fell, two more emerged from the mist. Day turned to night, and still the fighting raged. Fires flickered in the rain, the forest filled with screams, Latin commands drowned out by guttural war cries. Wolves circled at the edges, drawn by the smell of death. By the second day, the Romans were no longer an army. They were prey. Their formations broken, their officers slain, their will shattered. Varus himself, wounded and despairing, chose not to be taken alive. Tradition says he fell on his own sword, leaving his legions leaderless in the mire. 3 legions, 18,000 men, were swallowed by the forest. Shields, standards, wagons, all left behind, broken and drowned in mud. For Rome, it was a wound that would never fully heal. For the Germans, it was proof that even an empire could bleed. But victory came with a price. The tribes had united in the shadow of survival, but once the Romans were gone, so too was the fragile bond between them. Arminius, the man who had brought them together, would soon learn that betrayal does not end with one enemy. It echoes endlessly among friends. The forest lay silent at last. No horns, no screams, only the steady drip of rain from blackened branches. Smoke curled from abandoned Roman camps, their banners trampled into mud. The vultures had already begun their feast, circling low above the heaps of bodies. 3 legions, once the pride of Rome, were gone. Their eagle standards, sacred symbols of imperial power, were lost in the bogs and blood of Germania. News traveled swiftly, carried by trembling survivors who stumbled back toward the Rhine. By the time the message reached Rome, it was not simply a defeat. It was a disaster. In the marble halls of the empire, whispers spread like wildfire. Varus is dead. The legions are destroyed. Senators paled. Generals questioned their borders, and the common people of Rome asked a single fearful question. If the forests could swallow legions, could they one day swallow Rome itself? Emperor Augustus, the man who had turned chaos into empire, was shattered by the news. Ancient writers tell us he tore his robes, beat his head against the walls, and cried into the night, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." For Rome, the battle was not just a loss of men. It was the loss of an illusion, the illusion that their empire was invincible. But in the forests, the story was different. The Germanic tribes sang of Arminius as a hero, the wolf who had humbled the eagle. His name carried across longhouses and firesides, a tale of cunning and vengeance. And yet, unity was fragile. The tribes had gathered to strike down a common enemy, but with Rome in retreat, old rivalries returned. Chiefs quarreled over spoils, clans turned suspicion upon one another, and trust dissolved as quickly as it had formed. Arminius himself, once celebrated as liberator, found his triumph stained with doubt. Some called him a hero, others feared his growing power. His own kin accused him of grasping at kingship, of dreaming not of freedom but of rule. The man who had betrayed Rome was soon betrayed by his own. The mysterious ally who had whispered in shadows, who had guided him toward betrayal, faded back into obscurity. Some said it was fate itself. Others claimed it was another chieftain lost to history. But Arminius now stood alone, victorious, yet surrounded by enemies in every direction. And so his story, like the forest itself, ended not in glory but in shadow. Arminius lived on for years, harried by rivals, his alliances shattered. In the end, his own kin cut him down, not Romans, but Germans. The wolf who had devoured Rome's pride was torn apart by the very pack he had led. History remembers the Battle of Teutoburg as the day Rome stopped expanding eastward, the day the empire's limits were carved not in stone, but in blood and mud. But it remembers Arminius with a different silence, a man who won the greatest victory against Rome only to be undone by the very freedom he fought for. And so we are left with the bitter truth. Victory is never pure, freedom never absolute. The Romans lost their legions, but Germania lost its chance at unity. Perhaps that is why the forest still feels haunted, because some battles never truly end. If you found this story of betrayal and blood as haunting as I did, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. More forgotten histories await, where truth and myth collide in the shadows of time.